Hi everyone, and welcome to week 4. I just want to say that all you are responsible to do for this week, since it is completely asynchronous, is watch this video lecture. Watch this video lecture, come to lecture next week, which will be live, with any questions or general comments you have about the material, because what we're doing here is we're essentially starting off at a big funnel, right? Think of this class as a funnel of theory of social science, and throughout the course of the semester we'll be able to really narrow down our understanding of theories based on understanding what a theory is in general, and then isolating specifically different social science theories in communication. So what you did last week was really internalize and really make sense of the two different perspectives in conducting social science research. And I went on Beachboard to the discussion section, and I was kind of thrilled to find that each of you really had an opinion about the kind of research that you found most interesting, either interpretivist or positivist, and they have different names that are interchangeable. But what I'm going to do today is going to briefly recap the understanding around those two concepts if it didn't really sink in. And after I do that, I'm going to try to help you understand why social scientists tend to pick one method or one perspective over the other. Or sometimes people mesh the two to get the most out of a question. It'll all make sense in a few moments. Then from there, so after we kind of understand these two perspectives and really drive that home, what I want to do is spend a few minutes talking about the criteria of a good theory. And the criteria of a good theory, for the most part, as we'll see as we unpack this lecture, is really what I would really say common sense. But hopefully things will become more crystallized. I'm going to keep this video short because I know you're watching it on a mobile phone or your computer or laptop, and I don't want to fatigue you out. So let me go ahead and get started, and I'll pull up a PowerPoint deck right now. Alrighty, so today, this is kind of a two-part mini lecture I have planned. We're going to jump into talking about what theorizing social science means. I feel like a broken record when I start talking about theory, but it's quite important. And as you move on in your academic career, I hope you develop a kind of appreciation for what a theory really is. Recapping really briefly, last time we touched base on Zoom, we identified the different models of communication, how we started off with the linear model to the transactional model to the interactional model. We covered the 7 traditions of communication, from intrapersonal, interpersonal, group, organization, mass media. Our field is very vast, but something that ties each of these different areas of our field together are theories. And theories are not detached from our everyday reality. We theorize every single day. If you think about having a conversation with a friend or a family member, you probably have used the phrase, well, I got a theory about how this works, or I have a hunch around why this happens. When you engage in that type of conversation and that type of behavior, you're theorizing. Maybe not to the point of how a scientist who really does it in a very regimented, rigorous, empirical way does, but you are engaging in theory development. Theorizing is a formalized extension of everyday sense-making and problem-solving. What that means is that when we theorize, we formalize a program. We really make our thinking regimented and structured, and we try to make sense of the world around us. So if I'm thirsty, my mouth is dry, I know that if my mouth is dry, I'm thirsty. Therefore, dryness in the mouth leads to a state of thirst. And in order to kind of erase that state of thirst, I'll drink something, right? I just made a cup of coffee. That's why it came into mind. But essentially, we have understandings of how things work and why things work. And if we're really trying to make sense of why things happen and categorize and create models and charts and arrows and relationships, that is theory development. Whenever people pose an answer to one of their questions, we're engaging in theoretical thinking. So if you have an idea and you provide different reasons as to why something happens, you're engaging in critical thinking and theoretical thinking. For instance, if you see outside, maybe not now because it's always cloudy, but if you see outside that there are dark clouds starting to form and there's kind of a lot of gusts of wind, you can suspect that it's going to rain soon. Same thing goes right now. You know, if you look at the sky and you see it pretty dark, you probably think there's a fire out there. But essentially what we're doing here is we're engaging in this concept called implicit theorizing. And implicit theorizing is just this idea that we implicitly every day try to make rationales as to why something happens or doesn't happen. Because it's cloudy, we think it's going to rain. That's an implicit theory. But what is theory, right? Last week in your lecture, we identified and really thought through that. Really quickly, theories are abstract systems of concepts that indicate relationships among these concepts that helps researchers understand something. So I'll break down these two things. Essentially, think of a theory as a concept, a thing, an entity, and another thing, an entity, and there's a relationship. There's an arrow, there's a relationship that shows this goes here, or the relationship goes that way, and that's a theory. It's just understanding what things have a relationship with each other. Now, concepts are the words or terms that label the most important elements of a theory. So there are two types of concepts, and we touched about this in week 1. There's an idea of a nominal concept, which is describing something that we cannot really kind of have a concrete, we can't pick it up. For instance, democracy. You know, what is democracy essentially? As opposed to heat, thermal heat. Like, this is a cup of coffee, it's hot. I know I can measure intensity of heat. If this starts boiling, or if I put it on the stove, it'll start boiling and the heat increases or decreases. That is a real concept because I can physically, concretely assess heat. Versus democracy, love, sadness, confidence, right? We necessarily cannot really measure those concepts, but they do exist. What we try to do when we theorize is move things from a nominal concept to a real concept. So if we're trying to measure confidence in somebody, what we do is we try to understand what the heck confidence is. Does it mean walking with an attitude? Does it mean someone who feels secure? Like, we would start asking questions and we'd create a kind of scale. And we'd try to measure people's level of confidence based on those questions, and we'll assign them a score. We always try to move things to the real kind of perspective where we can really measure things. This will become a lot more clear when I give examples in a moment. So we talked about concepts. Concepts are things in the world. But essentially what a theory does is we try to understand the relationships, the way that concepts, one concept and the other concept is related. This is a model from a paper that a colleague of mine and I worked on, understanding why people walk distractedly. So what would lead someone to pick up their phone and walk and not pay attention to their environment? Distracted walking is actually a leading cause of injury in the United States. Distracted driving is up there with that. So this was trying to understand, why are people engaging in this behavior? What's developed in this model, it's not a theory yet, but it's working towards building theory, building understanding, is that in one side, you don't need to understand what's going on here, but I'm just going to break it down for you. We have concepts like on my left, so maybe your right, the image-based SNS, that means image-based social networking sites. For instance, Instagram, TikTok. SNS intensity, how intense someone uses an app. And FOMO, the fear of missing out. We thought these individual level variables or concepts had an impact on the distracting walking behavior, and that led to consequences like close calls, minor injuries or serious injuries. At the end, you see a box for gender and walking time. We thought those are variables that influence this relationship. So in this model, we have different concepts. FOMO, how do you measure FOMO? How do you measure the fear of missing out on something? Well, we really try to understand that concept and created questions to measure that. And we moved that from a kind of nominal concept to a real concept by asking questions and assigning an individual a score. So once we have FOMO, we move into distracted walking, and we kind of build this relationship with all these arrows, right? Not going to kind of go into this that much, but I just want to give you a perspective to kind of understand what we're talking about here. Now that we kind of understand that all the theory is just concept, a relationship between concepts. Sometimes it can get quite elaborate like this. But at the base level, it's understanding that something has a relationship or influences something else. There are goals to theorizing, and we have a lot of goals when we kind of theorize in an empirical way. We want to explain and identify the social world. We want to understand why people do the things they do. Why do people walk distractedly? And once we identify, we can understand the mechanism. Once we explain, we can understand the mechanism. So we understand that people maybe have a fear of missing out on social media. They fear missing out on something that is going to be posted, or the increased intensity of using an app makes people feel connected, right? Makes them want to continuously engage. It's kind of an addiction process. So once we explain and understand, we're able to predict behavior. And we're able to say, because someone has a high fear of missing out, they're more likely to walk distractedly. And here are the consequences of that. So now that we've predicted behavior theoretically and empirically with research, and if it's significant, our results are significant, we have conclusions that we make. So we can now say, well, the fear of missing out or increased social media use, someone's intensity on Instagram leads them to walk distractedly, which leads them to get hurt in an accident, right? So because of that, we know why people do it, how people do it, the reasons why people do it. We can build social change. We can now implement policy. We can work with congressional leaders. We can work with behavioral medical practitioners. We can work with technology developers, people who make these products, and say, you know what? Let's start tweaking the way that your product is being used. Why don't we change this in the product so we can stop this averse behavior? Those are the goals of theorizing. We're just out, the kind of what we're trying to do here in the game is understand social life, understand why people do the things they do, and ultimately, if your ethics are in line, create change for the good, right? Now, I'm not going to really talk much about these approaches to theory because we discussed that last week on the module. But again, there are different approaches. There are three. The only two I really want you to focus on is empirical and interpretivist. Empirical is also known as positivist, variable analytic, and interpretivist is the opposite of empirical approaches to theory. And then critical takes on a more abstract, what I would really describe critical as is a commentary around the way that society operates. Not so much testing things, but really commenting on the understandings of social life. Think of philosophy, think of Marx and Durkheim and all these grand people who develop theory at such a high level. And what we're trying to do here in social science is test these theories. So we're bringing it down to a more testable level through empirical and interpretivist approaches. A positive empirical or variable analytic approach, the main goal for that is to measure, test, predict, and describe something. And we usually rely on statistics for that. Experiments, surveys, all they're trying to do is understand the social world, quantify it through statistics so we can make predictions. So if we want to say and try to understand why people do the things they do, we'll survey people or we'll put them in an experiment and have them do what they do, and we'll measure, we'll test, we'll predict, and we'll describe what happened through statistics, through very objective, I say this loosely, but we're trying to take these findings, and because we collected them in such an objective, in such a rigorous way, where we control for a lot, we're able to be general and say most people in this population act this way or behave this way because we were able to collect data in a form that tries to understand human behavior at such a general level. Interpretivist theory, what the aims of this is really describing the behaviors of people and the realities of people in a very context-specific area. And we do this through naturalistic approaches like interviewing, focus groups. We're really trying to understand why people do the things they do, and that's about it. We're just really trying to describe processes. We're not in the business to test much in this perspective. Okay? I will bring up a point around how this can be done in terms of, let's say, social media use in a moment. And lastly, critical approach takes on a very humanistic approach where we try to understand structures in relation to power, in relation to kind of this grand commentary of why things affect one another. Really centered around power and understanding control. Let's not focus much on this approach in this class. This is an approach that really hones in on rhetoric and rhetorical studies. But for this particular class, we're really focused on the variable analytic approach, and sometimes we'll touch on the interpretivist approach. Okay. So some questions that come up. So if you really don't understand why we use theory and why we theorize, I came up with a few questions right now. So say you want to ask, does cell phone use before bed cause sleeping disruptions? Or how does cell phone use before bed affect sleeping disruptions? Cramming before a test leads to better performance? Or what forms of breakup communication lead to the cleanest breakup? You can take any of these questions and turn them interpretivist and research it through that form, or you can take that and roll with it in a positivist, empirical way. Let's take the I don't know, let's take the first question, I guess. Does cell phone use before bed cause sleeping disruptions? Well, what you could do is you could interview people who use their cell phone before bed, and you can ask them, how did you sleep? Why did did you think it affected your sleep? Talk to me, walk me through your sleeping routine. And from there, you'll get interview data, and you'll read it, and you'll synthesize and analyze it rigorously too. And you'll come up with the conclusion. People who use cell phones before bed are distracted. We find that people feel more stimulated, right? I'm making this up. Versus if you were to take a empirical approach, you'd probably, what you could do is you could do an experiment where you have one group use their cell phone maybe an hour before bed for an hour. You had another group use their cell phone for 20 minutes. You'll have another group who doesn't use their cell phone an hour or two before bed as a control group. And you would measure in the morning their level of sleep disruptions that they recount. Or you'd hook them up to machines and you'll read sleep pattern or a sleep study, and you'll mark and you'll say, okay, patient A had a lot of sleep disruptions based on this report. So because of that, you can make a conclusion and say the sample in group A who used a cell phone an hour before bed intensely had the most sleep disruptions compared to group, let's say B, who used it for 20 minutes and didn't have a lot of sleep disruptions. Therefore, we conclude that cell phone use before bed impacts sleep and causes disruptions. You see what I did there? I took one question and you approach it in two different ways. That is the foundation and the beauty of social science theory and the differences in which people have in conducting this research. I'm going to leave this up here. I'm not really going to go into it that much, but there are two different perspectives that we talked about, and we call positivist empirical approaches deductively. So we try to kind of think of it as an inverted pyramid. We want to be able to get a general understanding of a phenomenon and then apply it to specific cases. We're avoiding influences from other people and other conditions, versus interpretivist thinking kind of looks at one phenomenon, let's say cell phone use before bed, and we try to understand, we invert the pyramid the other way, we try to understand all the reasons why this happens. We talk to people, we get their experiences. Many of you talked about, I think the class is split 50-50, about how you either have a preference for positivist or interpretivist research, and ultimately it surrounds and it is really about the questions you ask and how you want to get your data and what you think is most relevant for your own work. I'm going to talk really briefly about this, and I'm looking at the time, I'm talking quite a bit, but I'm really going to talk about how this is applied in real life, okay? I remember a couple years ago, I worked for I can't disclose the name of the company, but a pretty big social media site, one of the top ones that people use on their mobile phone. And this particular social media company wanted to understand why people in a certain age range were not using their app compared to, let's say, 18 to 24-year-olds. They wanted to know why 40 to 55-year-olds weren't using the app as much. Part of my job was to conduct a research project to understand this within 2 weeks. One approach was taking a random sample of different age populations on this app and sending them out a survey. So every time you're on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter and you get a survey, they want to get your experience, or you see a survey and you take it based on the app. That is research being conducted through an empirical positivist approach. Another colleague of mine who was on the project wanted to understand this. So what I would do is what I pitched was to understand why people did what they did, and send them out a survey with different measures and really try to identify the specific variables and which variables and the responses carried the most weight. So we could rank and we could really do some A/B testing, kind of an experimental condition where for some people we'd give them a feature, for some people we wouldn't give them a feature, and we'd see how they use the app. Well, my colleague wanted to take on a more qualitative approach, an interpretivist approach, and select 20 random people in the younger subset and the older subset, and wanted to conduct a diary study. So we'd send them a text message, and we'd of course compensate them for their time, but every day they'd write around their experiences around using this app. Both approaches are great. We ended up doing both, and we were able to kind of vibe off of each finding. So in the diary studies, we found certain results, and we implemented that in the next survey we sent out. A lot of times there's not enough time or resources allocated to do this, especially, for instance, if you work in a nonprofit or a government agency, or if you have a quick turnaround time for a client. But I'm trying to really bring home the point here and drive home the point that these forms of research are conducted on a day-to-day. And it's quite amazing in how all of this really starts off with theory development. We try to understand the world that we live in. So recapping, I really try to do my best to help you get a really foundation of what theory is. Drive home these two approaches. You should pause this video, go get up, stretch, bathroom break, water break, coffee break, whatever. I'm gonna spend about 10 more minutes, or 5 to 10 more minutes in the next section of this mini lecture, talking around the good criterias of a good theory. So I'm gonna pause, give you a breather. All right, we are back. I'm gonna spend 5 to 10 minutes talking around the criteria of a good theory. Really wanted to drive home and make the point around theorizing the two different kinds of approaches we will look at in this class. And those two different approaches are deductive and inductive, as I kind of talked about a moment ago. I'm reiterating, I'm doing a lot of redundant things to make it stick. Deductive thinking starts off with a theory, and we go down to a hypothesis, observation, and we confirm it with statistics. Inductive thinking starts with an observation. Why did something happen? And we tend to build up. And what's different is that inductive thinking is not generalized. Deductive thinking is. We try to apply it to a lot of people. Talked about theories, the two different kinds of concepts. We talked about how concepts are connected to each other based on relationships. We're going to talk a bit about hypotheses right now. Hypotheses are just testable predictions between concepts that follow the general predictions made by a theory. So if we hypothesize that cloudy weather, so we have cloudy weather and we have rain. We hypothesize that cloudy weather, or cloudy clouds, dark gray clouds, has a relationship and influences rain. Rain will occur. That is a hypothesis that we can make. Very basic, very simple. But if we roll along with this, it'll all make sense in a moment. We talk about what a good theory is. Your textbook, definitely, I really rely on your textbook for this part because I think it does a good job to make things clear for you. A good theory has these 7 elements. If you think about a theory that has been upheld for years upon years and years, they have these 7 elements. Let me go through them. I'll talk about this in a moment, but what I want to kind of bring up is the fact that there is scope, which is the breadth of behaviors that a theory covers. So we try to make a point that the theory covers a breadth of behaviors. It is wide enough for its particular reason, and does not expand so much. So if we have a theory around why it rains, we should not talk about sunshine, or we should not talk about earthquakes, right? We need to scope it down in terms of rain, in terms of clouds, in terms of dark clouds. You want to scope it, and you want to make sure the theory is specific. It should have boundaries. It should be confined to a phenomenon. Logical consistency just states that the theory should hang together itself, and it shouldn't contradict itself. So if we say that dark clouds causes rain, we should not reach a conclusion and say dark clouds cause happiness, right? That doesn't hang together. It has no consistency. They're two different things. There's two different phenomena we're talking about. So it should have boundaries, and it should be consistent. It should hang together. It should have parsimony. A lot of people get caught up on the word parsimony. It just says that the theory is simple. Keep it simple. The theory has parsimony if it has a concept, another concept, maybe a third or fourth, and it's a direct relationship, or the relationship is simple. If you start adding all these variables and all these other concepts, it becomes less scoped, less specific, and it becomes too wide of a theory. Utility just means that it's useful, it's practical. You know, a moment ago we talked about distracted walking. That was a theoretical contribution we wanted to make because we thought it was practical and useful, and we thought that it could make some type of a difference in our understanding of human behavior. Lastly, second to lastly, testability, which just says that we're able to test the claims. So if I was to give my research report to another person and they were able to carry that out and find the same results, it shows that our theory is testable. Our theory holds up to replication. Heroism, which is the extent to that a theory has generated new thinking and research. So these are all elements that we want in a good theory. Not all theories have all of this. The best theories do. But as a scholar, as a researcher, as students, as future scholars and practitioners of theory, you want to keep an eye for these different types of variables or criteria of theory development. Lastly, a theory needs to be able to test time. We need to be able to tell and show that the theory remains applicable now, in the current way we live, and later. So maybe distracted walking was too focused on social media use, but the act of distraction. So if we were to take distraction, so bringing you back to the example I talked about a moment ago, if we were to talk about distraction, we already would identify that high usage of something, the fear of missing out, enjoyment of using an app or whatever technology influences distraction. So it needs to be tested in other contexts, but in order to develop a good theory, we need to be able to think about, does this phenomenon happen in other contexts? Can it lay the foundation for other contexts for it to exist? By the end of this semester, your goal is not to develop a theory. My goal is not to develop a theory in, one research study. It takes different research studies and multiple research studies and iterations to develop theory. Scholars develop their lives to developing different forms of theories, or testing, or discrediting, or revamping theory. It's always changing. Our social world is different every single day. Imagine the ways that we communicated back in the 70s are very different than the ways that we do it now. And it's changing the way that we behave. We're adapting. Essentially, this is the theory's durability over time, what we mean by test of time. I had this chart at the onset, but I figured it'd be most interesting to talk about it now. So I had it here again. There's a theory out there called media richness theory, and it's a theory based in organizational communication. So in the area of communication where we study people and organizations. All this theory says is that in order to reduce what they call equivocality, which is confusion, which is two people not seeing eye to eye in a workplace, and in order to make things and make communication more satisfactory, we need to be able to match our task with the media. One thing I should bring up really quickly is that this theory, it addresses this phenomenon here, and it talks about lean media and rich media. Lean media is media that doesn't have a lot of what I would call this human interactive component. So things like an email, a written letter, a text message is lean media. It's not rich, it's not meaty, it's not fatty media, right? Compared to, this is in the original theory, two-way radio, the telephone, FaceTiming, and then we actually have face-to-face communication. That is rich media. So there's two different kinds of media on the spectrum, right? Communication effectiveness on the left, it shows that if you read this diagram, it shows that the leaner the media, the less effective communication. The higher, the richer the media, so if you start going up, the richer the media, the more effective communication. Makes sense. Have you ever been stuck in a situation where you sent a text message and the other person freaks out and it's like, why did you say that? Or they get defensive and you're like, I didn't mean that. It's because the media was lean. You weren't able to fully express yourself the way you wanted to. So rich media is associated with high degrees of effective communication, while lean media is associated with lower effectiveness, ineffectiveness. Well, in regards to this theory, what this theory set out to do was try to understand different tasks in a workplace. This is a very oversimplified diagram, but what they found was that in order to get best task performance, better decision quality, decision time, efficiency, in order to have people feel satisfied with their work, you needed to match the media to the task. Simple concept, right? Think about it. Duh, it makes sense now. But back in the 70s and 80s, when this theory was really trying to take flight, people were having a hard time understanding because different media was being used in the workplace. For instance, now, if you work at an organization, you work for a company, a job, if you're going to talk to your boss about getting a raise, think about this theory. This theory would dictate that in order, because the task is more of a negotiative task, it's a higher stakes, and you really want the best quality of the conversation and you want high satisfaction, hopefully, you'll choose a rich media. You won't send a text message to your boss asking for a raise. You'd meet them in person. If you want to do something more small, more minute in terms of asking a question, like say, where can I find this particular file for the budget? You choose a leaner media because the task is less invasive. The task is less, there's less at stake there. You wouldn't ask for a face-to-face meeting to ask about a file. You send an email, you send a Slack notification, you send an instant message. Now that I described this theory, I want you to think about these different concepts. This theory has held true through the years. And maybe you disagree with it now, but it has these concepts. It's scoped. It's only dealing with workplace behaviors. It makes sense. It makes sense based on the expectations, based on the roles, the hierarchy in the organization. It has parsimony. It's simple. If we want to do specific things that have positive outcomes, we have to assess whether or not they, lead or are more adaptable to certain media. It has utility, testability, heroism, test of time. It's continuously being updated, maybe now with FaceTime and video conferencing being such a big thing, especially during the past couple of months, maybe this theory is time for a theory to be updated. That's the beauty of social science. It's the fact that we're able to think about the world, think about why people do the things they do, and implement change for the better. So now when companies write out their communication policies, or when they try to buy new software and technology that costs thousands and thousands of dollars, they know we want, this technology to be used for meetings, or we want this technology to be used for negotiations. And you're able to create a more unified, a more efficient, a more productive system. And it all starts with theory. It all starts with understanding the world we live in and try to make it better. Fast forwarding, we talked about all of this in terms of the 7 characteristics of good theory. We brought in this example, leaving you with just tying this all back in, right? This positive approach, this empirical approach generalizes. We want to be able to make things general. We rely on statistics to say, if you fall within the score, this applies to you. This applies to this population. While interpretivist thought is very context specific. We want to understand the why. Why do people engage in this process? How do they feel about it? What leads them to do this? Sometimes when you run statistics and you find answers to questions, you get a general understanding of why people behave a certain way. And you're able to say, okay, if you cram before, say the hypothesis is cramming before a test leads to worse or low performance. And you go ahead and you ask people how many did you cram or did you not cram for the test? And you see their scores and you're able to run a chi-square analysis and show, okay, cramming leads to lower scores. But an interpretivist approach would say, let me talk to people who scored high. Let me talk to people who scored low on this test and understand, did you cram? How did you study? If you crammed, why did you cram? What did cramming look like? And you're able to unpack the differences, the minute, nuanced differences in studies, in this study. Again, it depends on what you're trying to ask. It depends on what you're trained as a scholar to do. I myself have trained myself in my doctorate program in both because I feel like a statistical approach gets you answers and gets you, quick answers, statistically significant answers. But a qualitative interpretive approach gets you the understanding, the why. I will say, though, that in the world we live in terms of how policy is generated, how money and grant money and funding is distributed, most people take on a positivist approach because they see statistics as numbers, they see numbers as money. And if you're able to provide someone with a statistic and say, 1 out of 5 people believe this, or 60% of the population believes this, people are more willing to put money on that, sadly, rather than trying to take an interpretivist approach, which says, we surveyed a sample of these people and this is what they found, or this is what they said, this is what we found. There's no right or wrong. I don't have a preference between each method. As you move on in this semester, you'll you'll start hopefully developing an appreciation for each of these methods through the theories we cover. But those are the methods that go into theory development. There are 7 different criteria in terms of what makes a theory a good theory. I just want to briefly state that we did have a module around APA citation, which each of you did, and I will cover again next time really in brief, because if you have any questions I will cover. Because in week 6, I believe, your first assignment is due. I will upload the instructions for this assignment. This is one of the few low stakes assignments in this class, but it still carries a good weight on your final grade. I will talk about this assignment in detail next week, so please tune into the lecture. And I will upload the instructions on Beachboard. Essentially what you will do is you will find a theory, you'll cite the article where it came from, and you'll provide an understanding to me of which approach, either empirical or interpretivist, the study used in conducting their research. So this is the direct application of what we've been talking about for 2 weeks leading up to this assignment. I will again reiterate this assignment on Zoom next week, and I will give you 1 additional week from our Zoom lecture to complete it. So that should be enough time. I will upload the assignment. If there are questions, let me know. You can go ahead and get started early, but there is no need to. I just wanted to keep you updated. I like to kind of forecast what's coming up in this class, especially since we're online, okay? That's all you needed to do for this week. There is no participation portion of this module. All you needed to do was watch this. If you have questions, jot them down, ask me on lecture. And other than that, I want you to have a great rest of your week, and I'll see you next week on lecture. Take care.